Thanks so much for having me here. So first, quick check, just so I can get a sense of the audience here. How many people here consider yourself like a diehard sports fan? Like serious sports fan? Okay, how many people here consider yourself like a casual sports fan? Like you know what's happening, but you'll be fine if the Cubs don't make the World Series. Okay, and how many people would rather shave your head with a cheese grater than hear somebody talk about sports for 45 minutes? Okay, cool. What's your name, sir, if I could ask?
What's that?
What's your name, sir?
Craig.
Greg?
Craig.
Craig. I got it wrong with the Greg. Sorry, I'm sure that's never happened to you before. The goal for tonight's talk is to do something that speaks to the diehard sports fan, the casual sports fan, and Craig. If I can do that, then I'll know I did a decent job. Now, I grew up an absolutely psychotic sports fan. I grew up in the New York City of the 1980s. My room was a shrine to the stars of that time. People like Keith Hernandez, Dwight Gooden, Lawrence Taylor, Darryl Strawberry. I didn't know at the time that they all had serious cocaine problems. I just love them. No, seriously, looking back in my room, it was like the Tony Montana All-Stars. It was like an anti-Just Say No commercial. I love those guys so much. And I played sports. I was the starting center for my school's basketball team, seriously. I'm 5'10" on a good day. We were the Fighting Quakers at New York Friends, which, Fighting Quakers, it didn't exactly bring fear into the hearts of our opponents, especially when I went for the tip-off. But I didn't care, because I love sports. And I never, frankly, gave much of a damn about anything other than sports. I certainly didn't think about the politics of sports. I certainly didn't think about the messages that are pumped out through sports. And that changed for me, though, very dramatically in 1996 when a basketball player by the name of Mahmoud Abdul Rauf made the private decision that he wasn't going to come out for the national anthem before games. Now, I'll just show of hands of people who remember that moment, know what I'm talking about. Okay, some folks, good. So to explain it, Rauf just made this decision. He didn't tell anybody. There was no Twitter at the time or anything like that. So he just stayed in the locker room. He wasn't coming out for the national anthem. And a reporter got wind of it in Denver, found him in the locker room before the game and said to him, "Don't you realize that that flag is a symbol of freedom and democracy throughout the world?" And Rauf, you got to actually see the footage of this because it's amazing. Rauf gets this kind of twinkle in his eye, and he's kind of like, "Should I say it? Yeah, I think I'm going to say something." And he says, "Well, it may be a symbol of freedom and democracy to some, but it's a symbol of oppression and tyranny to others." Now, when Rauf said that, the sporting shit hit the fan. ESPN was like, "Rauf, peas on the flag, booyah, din-in-it," and it was like crazy intense witch hunt style stuff around Mahmoud Abdul Rauf. And in those long ago days, what we would do in college is we would all make sure we were in front of the dorm TV at 7 p.m. so we could watch SportsCenter so we can get the latest as far as what was happening with it. There were no updates that we could access at a moment's notice. And I'll never forget watching that, being a big sports fan, all the rest of it, and hearing somebody say, "Well, Rauf must see himself as one of those activist athletes like Muhammad Ali or Billie Jean King." And I remember hearing that and being like, what the hell is an activist athlete? Like, I had no idea what that was. So I tried to research it, once again, no Google. So, I had to resort to not only microfilm, but also microfiche. And trying to find out what is this thing called an activist athlete. And what I found out is that some of the grand moments in U.S. history, in so many respects, can't be explained without sports, which is why it's difficult to even understand the civil rights movement without understanding Jackie Robinson. It's difficult to understand the 1960s without understanding Muhammad Ali. It's difficult to understand the women's movement without understanding Billie Jean King. It's difficult to understand the LGBT movement without understanding people like Michael Sam, Jason Collins, etc. And you see the way in history all of these times when mass social movements step up off the field, they reverberate on the field with an electric intensity. And that's what I've sort of set myself to try to study and understand. Because what you see far too often is particularly people who see themselves as being on the left or believing in resistance politics. They treat sports the way the way a vegetarian would treat an all-you-can-eat buffet at McDonald's. Like, they see sports as something disgusting to be pushed away, something that's almost inherently reactionary. And the reality is quite different. It's a true story. I once went into a bookstore where I was doing a talk in a city. I don't want to name the city. All right, it was Philadelphia. And I went in there, and I was doing a talk about a book I wrote called What's My Name, Fool? And the cover of the book is a big Muhammad Ali face. And hey, held by Craig. Hold it up, Craig, so people can see it. See, Craig is in it. Craig is into it. Awesome. We accomplished some of our beginning goal. And excuse me. And I went in there, and I said, hey, I'm here to talk about What's My Name, Fool? I'm Dave Zirin. And this guy behind the counter, he said, but you're white. And I said, well, yeah, last I checked. It's an odd thing to say when someone comes into your store. And he said, but isn't that you on the cover of the book? And this was one of those like lefty bookstores. And I remember looking around the bookstore and seeing like they're selling posters of Emma Goldman and Malcolm X and Dr. King. And I'm just like, my goodness, here's this lefty bookstore. There's all of this resistance stuff everywhere. And they don't know the most important and most famous war resistor in the history of war. And that's a history that we should reclaim and hold absolutely proudly, because it is an absolutely remarkable history. And the more I studied it, the more I saw that there's even a huge gap between the history that we're taught, like the kind of very mainstream sports and politics history, and the actual history as well, which shouldn't be too surprising. Because as anybody who's read your Howard Zinn knows, you know that you got your history, and then you got the real story. And I think sports is no exception to that. And unfortunately, and this is why I think so many young kids aren't interested in history, the real story is so much more interesting than the history. And so you take Jackie Robinson, who I just mentioned. The movie came out about him called 42. I stopped counting the historical inaccuracies in it at 42, because I just figured, like, geez, it's getting too depressing. There's some good things about the movie, but it's like you hear about Jackie Robinson, but what you don't learn is that in the 1930s, there was a mass movement to integrate baseball. I mean, people held marches in the streets of Chicago and New York, and they were organized largely through the efforts of the sportswriter of the Communist Party's newspaper, The Daily Worker. Now, when I say that, people's first reaction is, wait a minute, the Daily Worker had a sportswriter? It's like, yeah, they did. And his name was Lester Rodney, and he lived to be 96 years old, sharp as a tack. And I got to interview him a lot before he passed on about 8 years ago. And I'll never forget talking to him and asking him all these questions. And he had these amazing stories about things they would do. Like the Yankees, for example, would hold open tryouts at the stadium, and it would be like a PR stunt in the 1930s. And they would show up with like 10 black players and be like, all right, we're here. All right, let's do the open tryout. And the Yankees would have to do the open tryout. Or another story he told where they were interviewing in the locker room a young rookie by the name of Joe DiMaggio. And they asked Joe DiMaggio, hey, Joe, like these are all like the regular sports writers, who's the toughest pitcher you've ever faced? And Joe DiMaggio, who wasn't necessarily a political person, just an honest young kid from an immigrant family in San Francisco, he just thought, and he said, I think the toughest pitcher I ever faced was Satchel Paige. And, you know, you could have heard a pin drop, Satchel Paige being the great Negro League pitcher. And the next day, there was no mention of any of it in the regular press. That Joe DiMaggio even said this, but the Daily Worker in a huge font was like, Satchel Paige, best pitcher ever, says Joltin' Joe, you know. And that was the sort of things that he did. And I'll never forget talking to Lester Rodney about all of his stories, about him being there live at the Joe Louis-Max Schmeling fight, 1937. And it was, Max Schmeling was Hitler's favorite boxer. Joe Louis was the hero in the Depression era, not just of Black America, but also a very left-wing radicalizing white working class. And there would be mass events where people would listen to the fight on radio. He wasn't at these because he was covering the fight live, but he told me stories of like in Birmingham, Alabama, there was a communist party that had 1,000 people in a room all listening to the radio broadcast of this fight, and it was armed on the outside of people who were like making sure that no one would try to break it up with violence. And I hear these amazing stories, and at one point Lester stopped because he's this really modest guy. He lived in a one-bedroom home in a place like right outside of Oakland, and he said to me, why are you even asking me this stuff? Why do you think anybody cares? And I said, well, I think people care because it's a hidden history and everybody loves sports. And it's also kind of like this ideological Trojan horse where we can teach people the radical history of America and do it by talking about sports. We can do that, Lester. And Lester looked at me and he said, to be 80 again, which was, and he's just an awesome guy, an amazing human being. But Jackie Robinson is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, so much of this history, there's this undercurrent, like Muhammad Ali. Today, he's the closest thing we have to a walking saint probably in this country, although I think it says something very damning about this country that he was only embraced once he lost the power of speech. But I think one of the things that is only now being resuscitated is just how radical and how dangerous he was in the 1960s. Just a quick, and he said things like he was the most famous athlete on earth, standing up tall and saying things like, "The real enemy of my people is here. I will not disgrace my people, my faith, or my family by traveling 5,000 miles to dominate other darker people of the world at the behest of the white slave masters." I mean, and this is like the most famous athlete on earth saying this. And they say, if I have to go to jail, that's fine. You know, my people have been in jail for 300 years. So, and people would just be like, oh my God, we actually have to print this. Now, they printed it by calling him Cassius Clay because even the so-called liberal New York Times had a policy to not call him Muhammad Ali until 1970. 6 years after he changed his name, but he wasn't scared to actually speak truth to power, even though it cost him dearly. And one little Ali tidbit, like once again, something that's cut out of the history, is when Martin Luther King, very famously in 1967, he came out against the war in Vietnam. He did so against the advice of many of his top advisors. He was pilloried by the media for daring to bring together the issues of the war abroad and the war at home. He spoke about the brutal solidarity that white and black soldiers fighting together to kill brown people in South Vietnam when they weren't able to live on the same street in the south of the United States. And his advisors said, don't say it, don't say it. Friends of his in the press said, don't say it, don't say it. And the day of King's Riverside speech in 1967, where he fully articulated his reasons for opposing the war in Vietnam, he was asked the question, why are you doing this? And King said, well, it's like Muhammad Ali teaches us, all these issues are connected. So Ali made Dr. King brave. I mean, that's an amazing sports politics connection. And it wasn't just Muhammad Ali who did that. Staying on King for 1 second, we did some research into speakers' requests in southern branches of the NAACP in the late 1950s. And their number one most requested speaker, who southern branches wanted to come and speak to them, was Jackie Robinson. And number two was Martin Luther King. And that's hilarious if you think about it, because imagine people planning a meeting and being like, all right, can we get Jackie Robinson? He's busy. Damn, all right, we'll get Dr. King. God, I can't believe we got to settle for Dr. King. But that's like the power of sport. And Dr. King wouldn't have had no problem with that, because as he once said about Jackie Robinson, he said he was a sit-inner before sit-ins, a freedom rider before freedom rides. And which is true, because he broke the color line in 1947, years before the start of the formal civil rights movement. He did that when Mike King, as Martin Luther King was known, was playing pool in Boston University, getting his doctorate. And so it's just like this whole world was existing where people were using sports as a platform to stand up and speak out and try to make nonviolent change in a very violent world. And all of but the question that I've been wrestling with recently a great deal, and this is something I hope we can even talk about tonight, is the question why? Like, why does it matter so much? Why does sports have such an impact? And it's a question that I think about a great deal, because you understand why someone like Jack Johnson or Jackie Robinson had such an impact, because there was such little opportunity in this country for black voices to actually be heard. And so the way excellence and creativity, I mean, nature abhors a vacuum. Sports was a place where that could be expressed. And then that platform was used heroically by people throughout the decades. And today, though, it still matters so much, even with a black president, even with a black attorney general, even with some black CEOs, even with this infrastructure of black power, it still matters a great deal. And I think about why that is. And I certainly have my own theories about why that is that I'm happy to share. But I want to say one of the things that made me realize that it still matters and is still so important is something that I went through just last week. I was in, people who read my blog know this happened, but do people know I was in San Antonio a week ago? Show of hands if you knew I was in San Antonio. All right, just say it to some of the folks here. It was pretty damn cool. I was in San Antonio with 1968 Olympian John Carlos, one of the people who raised his fist on the medal stand in '68. And we were there at the behest of Greg Popovich to speak to the San Antonio Spurs. And he was bringing John Carlos. I was there to sort of give the intro, and then it was really about John Carlos there to speak to the team. And I mean, we're talking like, I mean, it was the trippiest experience of my life, because it's like, me and John Carlos are doing this talk, and we're talking about racism, war, imperialism, and it's like, oh, hey, look, Tim Duncan. I mean, it was a weird kind of experience. I mean, so it's like you're doing this talk, and like Tony Parker's like taking notes, and you're just like, oh, Jesus Christ. So it was all very trippy. And there are three things about the experience that I'll never forget. The first is we had a dinner, and people know who R.C. Buford is. He's an NBA Executive of the Year of the Spurs. Well, I spilled a drink on his iPhone, so that was great. That's one thing I won't forget. Yeah, very cool. I was really, I was like, bleh. It was awful. It was like I'm at an 8th grade dance again or something. And the second thing that I'm really like absolutely never gonna forget is that Greg Popovich, pardon my language, there are no kids here. I mean, I gotta tell you, is a cool motherfucker. Like, he does not care. Like, he is a non-giver of fucks. Like that day, there was an article on ESPN's website about all the players he coached when he coached at a D3 school in 1980. And I asked him about it. He had no clue about the existence of the article. Couldn't care less about it. But then when he heard that I knew something about Russian history, he's like, oh my God, I studied the Russian Revolution at the Air Force Academy. We did Soviet studies. Like, what do you know? And he wanted to talk about Russian history at that point, more than he gave a crap about what was happening in the NBA. And so he's a cool, and he really is someone who cares about the players. And so he brought John Carlos in, and we said to Pop, I said, what should we talk about? And Pop said, well, I watched you guys speak on some YouTube stuff, and he pointed John Carlos, and he said, you talk a lot about the fact that in 1968, you didn't care if you won the gold medal. What you cared about was using your position to make change. I want to tell this team that they shouldn't care about winning a championship. And I'm like, what? You don't expect to hear that. But that's what he asked of us to do. And also he wanted us to speak about this came up because we were all talking about this, but he said to me, what do you want to talk about? What are some things to talk about? And so we said a million things. I kept talking like diarrhea of the mouth. And the one thing that he grabbed on and said, talk about that, was I talked about the fact that I've interviewed almost everybody who was on that 1968 Olympic team. And what's crazy is some of the folks back then stood with John Carlos and Tommie Smith, and some didn't stand with John Carlos and Tommie Smith. And when you talk to the people who did, they're now 70 years old. They are so proud of the fact that they stood with them. Now that they're old and gray in the rocking chair, they are proud that they stood on the side of the people who were raising their fists in the 1968. And the ones who didn't stand with them are sheepish and a little bit embarrassed. And they don't really like talking about it too much. And I interviewed George Foreman about this. He famously did not stand with them in 1968. And George was just he was a kind of a fumbling presence about it. He didn't want to say that, well, he did what he did. And then out of nowhere, he started singing Bob Dylan songs. It was just very weird. This is true. I said, well, why didn't you? He said, to me, the 60s were just like that Bob Dylan song where they say, they stone you when you try to do no good. They stone you when you're and he goes, everybody must get stoned. And then he said, you see, that to me, Dave, is about what it's like when you're trying to make change and people are throwing stones at you. And I said, no, I think it's about weed. And he said, no, man, everybody must get stoned means everybody must sacrifice. And that day I wasn't ready to sacrifice, but we all have our moment where we have to get stoned. And I'm like, I think it's about weed, George. And so, not the most politically coherent of conversations, to put it mildly. But that's what Greg Pop said. He said he asked me to say that to the team, and so I told that story, and I talked about Black Lives Matter. And what was really strong about it is they just signed a player named David West. And David West has been very outspoken about Black Lives Matter. He took about 1/5 of what he could have gotten to stay with the Pacers to go to this team. And I learned that the Spurs are kind of like this magnet for people who are willing to take less money to not be around assholes. It's like just this group of people who really want to be there. This is crazy. Now I'm like doing PR for the Spurs, which was not my intent at all. But one of the things I said was like, look, you might have teammates who stand Black Lives Matter. There's several people in this room who've tweeted about it. This issue is not going anywhere. Remember that example from 1968, because if you don't stand with your teammates on this issue, which is like the social justice issue of our time, like, are we as a country going to be fine with the fact that there is a whole segment of society that sees the police and feels like they may not survive that encounter? It's like, are we okay with that, or are we not okay with that? If we're not okay with that, you're going to have teammates who say they're not okay with it. You may not feel like you can say that, but are you going to stand with your teammates' right to stand up and be heard? Are you going to stand with your teammates' right to use that platform? And then John Carlos got up there and he spoke, and it was amazing. Like, people just, he just spoke for like a minute, and then it was just questions, and the questions were unbelievably sophisticated and deep. But the thing about it that I'll remember the most is that afterwards they had practice, and we watched the practice, and Pop kept it very loose, and players kept coming over to talk to John Carlos. And so you had Manu Ginobili standing with Carlos for 45 minutes, just asking him questions about COINTELPRO. And how do you resist? I mean, it was very surreal. But the thing about it that was so interesting to me is that it raises that question I said before, which is why do they care? I mean, these are millionaires. They play for the Spurs. It's all this, the champions. Here's John Carlos. He's 70 years old. And he talked about how he didn't win a gold medal. And that's what matters, is making change and using your position. And they wanted to hear that. And I really do think that what it comes down to at the end is the fact that we still live in a country that has a very, very, very unlevel playing field. That you still have profound disadvantages in this country based on the color of your skin, based on your gender, based on your sexuality, and yet sports is held up as this myth of the level playing field. And if you're good enough, you can play. And so I think that's where sports is this place where a lot of this then gets worked out. Because, well, if the ethos of America is if you're good enough, you should be able to succeed, but the reality is that there's tons of structural bigotry and prejudice that prevents that from happening, then sports is a place oftentimes where a lot of that is exposed. Well, if anybody can play, why isn't Michael Sam on an NFL team? These questions then come up. If anybody can play, why is it that women athletes are faced with the choice of either objectifying their own bodies or finding themselves having no commercial outlets whatsoever? If anybody can play, why is it still news in 2015 that Jessica Mendoza is the first woman to do a Major League Baseball playoff broadcast from ESPN? How in 2015 is this still news? Why are we still here? Why was the first ever female referee just in the Monday Night Football game that we just saw? And speaking of which, Becky Hammon, assistant coach on the Spurs, what a badass. And seeing her coach the players was unbelievable, and the respect they had for her. And it was amazing to see. But then it also would ask the question, why is this amazing to see? Because you cannot believe that this is the first woman with the capacity to coach men's players, yet there it is. 2015. So we still live in a profoundly unequal country and on a profoundly unequal playing field. And I think it still matters because of the question of class. Because it may be true that you have a black president, a black attorney general, what have you, people who went to the best schools, etc. But we still are in a position where if you are poor, if you are a person of color, if you are black, you do not have the microphone. You do not get to express your situation. And sports represents this very unique space where people can be heard. So when you have athletes standing with the Black Lives Matter movement, it becomes something that actually has the power, I call it the power to puncture privilege or the power to sever segregation, because you're forcing people, aka sports fans, to hear things they might not necessarily want to hear. I'll never forget, I have a cousin, he's a working class guy, he spends most of his time in a car as a salesperson. wasn't thinking about Black Lives Matter or anything of the sort. And then all these things happened with NBA players wearing the I Can't Breathe shirts last fall. And he's hearing this on sports radio. And he got curious, and he went home, and he saw the video of the police killing Eric Garner. And then he called me up, and he said, "Oh my God, can you believe this is happening?" And I'm like, "Yes, I absolutely believe this is happening." He's like, "We have to do something." And I'm like, "People are doing something," you know? But it was like his eyes opened for the first time, but he had the privilege, the choice, the whatever language you want to use, to not care about Eric Garner until it invaded his space when he was just trying to chill and listen to sports radio. That's, I think, the power of athletes speaking out. And I feel like I'm telling people in Seattle things they already know, because you have a football team where a debate about the Black Lives Matter movement just took place on the podium. And I wanted to read a couple of excerpts from it because it really is interesting. Because it's like, so it started with Richard Sherman. And I won't give the backstory on it, but he was there and he was questioned about, it's a long story. It's like someone posted something under his name. He said it wasn't him. And so he wanted to explain what he feels about Black Lives Matter. And this is what Richard Sherman said. He said, "I dealt with a best friend getting killed. It was two 35-year-old black men who did it. Wasn't no police officer involved, wasn't anybody else. And I didn't hear anybody shouting Black Lives Matter then." And I think that's the point we need to get to, is that we need to deal with our own internal issues before we move forward and start pointing fingers and start attacking other people. We need to solidify ourselves as people and deal with our issues, because I think as long as we have black on black crime and one black man killing each other, well, if Black Lives Matter, then it should matter all the time. That was Richard Sherman. Michael Bennett, the next day, gets up to the podium. Keep in mind, Michael Bennett was not asked about Richard Sherman. He said, "I have something to say before the questions." And he said, "I was reading Richard Sherman's quotes yesterday. I would like to say I disagree with what he said. I think when people talk about Black Lives Matter, he is misinterpreting it. Black Lives thing is more about the social injustice, not about people killing within the community. It's about the social injustice of the people that are supposed to protect them and building the community to resist them. Richard's opinion is different from mine. My opinion is I believe in the things that people are trying to do. These things go all the way back to 1955, to Emmett Till. You got to think about it. The last hanging in America was in the 60s. There's a lot of social injustice that's been going on for a while." So I think probably a lot of folks here are familiar. If you've been to any activist meeting or any public meeting, you've heard this debate play out about black on black crime, and why don't people talk about white on white crime? And you've heard these kinds of debates go forth and back and forth. I recommend, if you're interested in these, Michelle Alexander's writing on it is utterly brilliant about why black on black crime is a complete and utter farce and a canard that's held up by people who could not give two shits about black lives 99% of the time. But what's so interesting about this case is that this is also a debate that most people, let's be honest, aren't going to the activist meetings. And they aren't hearing these debates. And so then they're hearing it because it's being talked about by these two players. Another thing that happened recently is people might know the case of Thabo Sefolosha. Thabo Sefolosha just basically, he was walking outside a nightclub last April, and the New York City Police Department, they thought he wasn't walking fast enough away from a melee at a club, so they broke his leg. Now, confrontations between NBA players and the police have been going on as long as there have been NBA players and the police. And there are basic reasons for this. One has to do with the fact that police tend to target black people in expensive cars and clothes, and NBA players tend not to like to be told by police officers what they should and should not do. But usually when these things happen, and there's stories that people don't know about, like I remember Chris Webber, when he was playing, he got pepper sprayed in his car, and Gilbert Arenas once got arrested for tapping a police officer on the shoulder when they were arresting one of his teammates. Like, all kinds of bullshit happens all the time. Dale Davis was tased after saying to a police officer, it was like, "Move along, hurry up," and he was like, "What are you gonna do, tase me? I dare you to tase me." Police officer tased him. Usually what happens in these cases is the powerful NBA steps in, it seems like mutually this is bad publicity, let's just push this away. But this time it was different. And Thabo Sefolosha fought back. And he risked his own freedom by not taking the sweetheart deal, by not settling out of court, and actually putting his livelihood and his freedom on the line by taking it to court. And he won. The jury, they didn't even meet long enough for the free lunch. They met for like 45 minutes, came out and said, yeah, the police did this, not guilty. And I think, like, we asked Thabo Sefolosha why he did that. It has everything to do with the climate and what's happening around us at the time. And so that's what makes that so important. So obviously I'm talking a lot about race, but I think what the main thing point I want to make is that the history that exists of people using this platform to speak out, it's a weaponized history. Like, it's a history that we can use, and it still has profound resonance today. And I want to say a little bit about, I could do whole talks about this that are just about women in sports, about LGBT people in sports, but I want to say a little bit about women in sports just because, first of all, 2015 has been the year of women in sports. I mean, this has been the year of Serena Williams. This has been the year of Ronda Rousey. This has been the year of the Women's World Cup team. This has been the year of Sasha Banks. If you don't know who that is, you can Google her. Thank you. That's a pro wrestler. But amazing. And so it's been the year of women in sports in so many different respects. Jen Welter, Becky Hammon. And I think it's worth knowing, though, that the fight for women's space in sports has always been a question of access, and it's always been a social question. Like, have you ever wondered why women's tennis is best of 3 sets instead of best of 5? I mean, it's weird, right? Like, you think, why is it best? A lot of people don't know that women's tennis, like the first Wimbledon tournaments, it actually was the best of 5. But women played tennis in corsets, and that was the uniform. And women were passing out on the court because, I don't know if you knew this, but corset, you can't breathe. So the people who ran Wimbledon, this is true, this is real history, they met and they said, what are we going to do about this? Someone's going to die on center court. And they said, what should we do? Should we get rid of the corsets? No, let's keep the corsets, but let's make it best of 3 sets instead of best of 5. And that continued to be the case into the 1920s when a woman named Lottie Dodd won Wimbledon. She was 15 years old. She had a corset exemption. And she said that she pleaded with the Wimbledon organizers and said the tournament would have been so much more challenging and interesting, she said, if my opponents had been allowed to breathe. So yeah, I mean, it's like, how dare she? Yeah, and it's like it's been a social question from the beginning, like the fight for basic access. And what's so remarkable about it too is that this was the idea that women should not even play sports was something that was said by not just like the church, by government, by society, because for a very simple reason, that sports were refashioned at the turn of the 20th century as a way to build this new American century. It was basically refashioned in the turn of the century for imperialism, for this idea that sports is going to breed a new generation of men, white men, with the ability to conquer the world. And women were not to be trained in that, so they were told not to play sports. And they were told to wear corsets, and their very bodies were shaped in such a way so they couldn't play. And my favorite example of this, and I love reading this because people are just like blown away by this, is in the 1878 edition of the American Christian Review, which was a very actually popular magazine of the day. I guess it was the Entertainment Weekly of its time. And they diagrammed the 12-step downfall of any woman who dared engage in the sinful world of croquet. And it truly is a very slippery slope. So I'll just read you the 12 steps here. So they go, step 1, social party. Step 2, social and play party. Step 3, croquet party. Step 4, picnic and croquet party. Step 5, picnic, croquet, and dance. Step 6, absence from church. Step 7, immoral conduct. Step 8, exclusion from the church. Step 9, this one's my favorite, more croquet. It's like, you got all that non-church time. It's like, what else are you going to do? Step 10, poverty, which to me is a hell of a leap. Hell of a leap. Like, you're just like playing croquet. Like, damn, I'm poor. Step 11, shame and disgrace. And step 12, ruin. And you thought it was just croquet. And all of this fear was also extremely tied up in fears about women's sexuality. And that's the other thing when you read like the Journal of American Medicine, it's like they go back and forth about what will sports inspire women to be. And it's some combination of lesbian or prostitute, like prosta-lesbians. Like they had just, like it was like this complete like women's sexuality was so incomprehensible to the men who were defining what women's sexuality was. And they saw sports as just being like this space because it was space that they felt like they couldn't necessarily control. So they restricted it as much as possible. And if you've ever seen the early films of women playing basketball where they're running around in hoop skirts, then you see how they tried to restrict it. Like they feared the power that sports could unleash. But there was a big challenge to this at the time that the American Christian Review and the Journal of American Medicine were telling women not to play sports, and it was a new invention. And that invention was the bicycle. And it seems odd to say this now, but the bicycle was revolutionary as far as women in sports because it meant health, it meant freedom, and you can't ride a bicycle in a hoop skirt and a harness. So it's like the very definition of the bicycle made it something that was liberatory. And the early suffragettes knew this. Susan B. Anthony once said the invention of the bicycle did more for women's liberation than I ever could. I think it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that when we finally win the right to vote, we're going to be going to the polls on a bicycle. Like whole pamphlets were written about why women should ride, as a political point, should ride bicycles. And in response to that, the Journal of American Medicine, they published a report saying that women who rode bicycles had several dangers before them. One was that they could be subject to something called the bicycle face, which was an actual medical term. That if women rode bicycles too much, their eyes would bug out, their face would develop this strained expression, and I swear to God, it sounds like what your mom would tell you when you were 5, but these doctors said it will freeze that way. So basically, they couldn't have known it at the time, but they were saying, ladies, you'll look like Dick Cheney if you ride a bicycle. And the other thing that they said was that if you land wrong on a bicycle, you will never be able to have children, and it could actually lead to the implosion of the uterus. Like the uterus would collapse unto itself if riding a bicycle incorrectly. And I'm still waiting for the women's punk band called Imploding Uterus. I think if anybody wants to take up that project, please do. But what's so fascinating about it is, Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. This past year, there's a woman unbelievably named Joan of Arc Girabuntu, who became the first woman from Rwanda to ever compete in a first-tier international bicycle race. Now keep in mind, bicycle riding in Rwanda is like football in the United States on steroids. Like Rwanda is a country of, I think, roughly 11 million people. Someone should look at it. It's in the low teens. But the Tour of Rwanda is what it's called, the Rwanda Tour de Rwanda. 3.5 million people came out to watch. And she was so amazing and so incredible that she was sort of plucked out. She was put in the South African Academy. And this woman named Joan of Arc just raced last month in Richmond, Virginia, in front of 750,000 people. Came out to see this tour event. First Rwandan woman to ever do this. And it's not just that she's this unbelievable talent. It's not just that she's faster than most of the men in Rwanda. It's the fact that even to ride a bicycle in Rwanda is to actually have to confront a lot of the same barriers that women in the United States confronted a century ago. A lot of the same myths, a lot of the same obstacles. And the fact that she not only is confronting them, but that she's returning home a hero and an example for everybody throughout the country is unbelievable. And the other thing that it does is it has the power to put Rwanda in people's imagination beyond just the horrific massacre and genocide that took place in 1994 and 1995, a genocide amidst of which she was born in dire poverty. So, I mean, that's the power of the bicycle, and it still remains true to this day. And all it says to me at the end is that what Howard Zinn once said is so incredibly true. He once said, "I study history not because I care about the past, I study history because I want to change the future." So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.